Good afternoon and welcome to the Michigan Virtual Barn School, The Basics. My name is Mallory Bauer and I have the privilege of serving as the field representative for the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. And we're so glad that you are able to join us here this afternoon in this virtual space. There we go. In order to maximize your participation, I just want to familiarize you with Zoom, the software we're using to present this webinar. We will be collecting questions in the Q&A box. It's a really easy way to keep track of all the questions that may come in during the presentation. To access the Q&A box, you might need to wiggle your mouse a little bit, and there's a toolbar that should pop up from the bottom of your screen. And there's two little chat bubbles or talk bubbles, and it says Q&A, and you can click in there and type in your question at any point during the presentations that will be presented today. We will be saving most of the questions until the end of the presentation, but as I said, keep those questions in as soon as they pop in your mind so you don't forget them by the time we get to the questions at the end. We will be using the chat window to drop links to resources that might be discussed during the presentation. These links will also be sent out in a follow-up email. So if you don't happen to find the chat or you just forget to pull from those links, we will send those out to you so you don't have to worry about that. We are going to do a poll, and so I'm going to pause in just a moment to do that. So I don't forget. So please participate in that poll. And we also have a survey that will be sent out. It will be in your browser when you close the webinar at the end. And a link to that survey will also go out in our follow-up email. So I hope you'll take a minute to take that survey. We are collecting information so that we can make sure that these webinars are engaging and information that you are seeking in your preservation work. So thank you so much again for joining us today, and I hope you will enjoy our time with the Michigan Barn Preservation Network. So before I forget though, I am gonna throw this poll up. So there we go. We just were wondering who all in the audience is affiliated with or owns a barn, or if you wish you owned a barn, if you're just here for the information, just trying to gauge who is in the audience and what brought you here today. So we'll let that sit up there for just a few more seconds. Panelists, if you want to participate, you are able to as well. Make sure you hit submit. If you have clicked one of the boxes, make sure you hit submit so it comes through. All right, well, I will end this poll. Thanks to all who participated, and I will share the results. So we have about half of the people in attendance do own a barn. Many who wish they did, here for the information. So thank you so much. That's really helpful for us. All right. So as I said, my name is Mallory Bauer, and I am with the Michigan Historic Preservation Network, and our mission is to advocate for Michigan's historic places that contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We are the statewide nonprofit that keeps our fingers on the pulse of preservation throughout the state, and we are a membership-driven organization. So if you would like to support our mission, please check out our website at www.mhpn.org and find out more about what we're doing. This is one in a series of webinars that we will be having throughout the 2021. So also keep an eye on our website for announcements for those future educational opportunities. And then finally, these webinars are supported in part by an award from the Michigan Council for the Arts and Cultural Affairs and a grant from the Michigan Preservation Fund of the Michigan Historic Preservation Network and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And we just want to thank those generous sponsors who are help us bring this information to you at no cost, and this will also go on YouTube so you have access to it whenever you need, and you can share it with anyone, even if they couldn't participate live today. So thank you so much for that support. So now I am going to turn it over. We are joined by a panel of knowledgeable barn experts from across the state, all affiliated with the Michigan Barn Preservation Network. And they'll tell you a little bit about their mission. And that includes Stephanie White, Steve Steyer, and Tamis Donaldson. So we're really excited to have you all here today. And Stephanie is going to start us off. So thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Mallory. And thank you to the Michigan Historic Preservation Network for doing all that you do. The Michigan Barn Preservation Network is a volunteer-based statewide nonprofit dedicated to promoting appreciation, preservation, and rehabilitation of Michigan barns, farmsteads, and rural communities. Our Michigan Virtual Barn School is based on Steve's Michigan Barn and Farmstead Survey Manual, as well as our Barn School booklet, which is available on our website, and we'll put the link to that in the chat. I will begin with terminology. Because we're the Michigan Barn Preservation Network, let's start with the word preservation. It's the act or process of keeping something in existence. There are different ways to go about preserving a barn. You can either preserve a barn by stopping all deterioration. You can restore a barn and take it back to what it originally looked like. Or you can rehabilitate or adaptively reuse a barn and turn it into something else, like a house. The rest of my slides are going to show you the category in the top left corner of the screen and the word in the bottom left. The first category is farm buildings. This slide shows an aerial photo of a farmstead in Jackson County where we held a barn school last September. A farmstead is made up of all the structures making up a farm site, including the residences, barns, silos, and other outbuildings. The first farm building is a barn. A barn is a structure used to store a harvested crop or shelter livestock. A farmhouse is the dwelling used by people who lived on the farmstead. Sites may have more than one dwelling. Residences for hired farm workers might also exist. Occasionally, the original house is used as a granary, chicken coop, or other building after the new farmhouse was built. This house at the Grice Museum in Harbor Beach was built in phases. The wooden part came first, and then the stone addition about 10 years later. This building is a chicken coop in Frankenmuth. Usually, chicken coops are small and one-story with several windows facing south. Typically, they have a shed, gable, or half-monitor roof. This is a full monitor roof, but we'll talk about that later. The corn crib is used to store ear corn. It can be many sizes, shapes, and materials. Early corn cribs are wooden, 7 to 8 feet tall, narrow, gable or shed roofed structures, and raised on piers with narrow horizontal board siding. The longer sidewalls usually flared out at the top, like the photo on the right. Later cribs are longer and taller. Drive-through corn cribs have 2 cribs 8 feet apart with a roof covering both, like you see on the left. A granary is used to store small grains. As a freestanding building, it's small, rectangular, gable-roofed, and raised on piers to keep rodents out. It can be 1 or 2 stories with a few, if any, windows high up from the floor. It usually has a 3 to 4 foot walk-in door. Sometimes they're totally enclosed within a barn, not observable from the outside. A hog house, hog barn, or piggery are buildings used to shelter swine, usually medium-sized, 1 to 2 stories with a gable or gambrel roof. It may have several short doors along a sidewall. You can see one at the bottom left-hand corner. The lower walls are usually stronger than other farm structures and may be made of poured concrete, cement block, or ceramic tile. A machine shed is usually a long, one-story shed-roofed building. Originally, it would have been used to store horse-drawn tools and machinery. A milk house is a small, one-story building used to store and cool milk. Usually, it will be on grade and has a gable or hip roof. Many times, it's attached to the barn with a separate entrance. Usually, it's made of cement block like this one or ceramic tile. An outhouse is a small structure detached from but near the residence, originally used as a toilet. A silo is an upright cylindrical structure used to store silage. It can be made of wood staves with steel rod hoops, shown here, all metal and bolted together, poured concrete, concrete blocks, glazed tile, and rarely is made of stone. A windmill is a tower structure with a large fan and tail at the top. Wind turns the wheel and a gear mechanism converts the rotary motion to a reciprocating motion for pumping water. That wraps up our farm buildings. Now we'll move on to barn shapes. And by shapes, I mean the shape of the footprint or the floor plan from a bird's eye view. First, we have rectangular, where two sides of the same length are longer than two other sides of the same length. This photo was taken on one of our beloved barn tours. We currently have a self-driving drive-by tour in the thumb area, and we'll send the links out for all of that at the end. Next, we have square, where all four sides are equal. Here is an L-shaped barn, which means that two rectangular plans come together to form an L. This photo shows what looks to be a T-shaped barn, which has two rectangular plans with one bisecting another. The most popular polygon, I think, is the octagon with 8 equal sides. This photo is of the Thumb Octagon Barn in Gagetown. Round barns are also pretty amazing. This one here is called the Round Barn Brewery in southwestern Michigan. And this I really just wanted to show because I thought it was unique, but it's a mix of round and T-shaped. That concludes our barn shapes. Now we're moving on to roof shapes. This photo shows two gable roofs. A simple roof, the gable has two sloping sides opposite one another. The side walls are shorter while the end walls go all the way up to meet the roof peak. This side with the mural is called the gable end. The other two sides are called eave ends because that little roof overhang is an eave. Also, I have to say that this barn is one of the Port Austin art barns, and it's also on our current barn tour. This little part of a larger barn has a shed roof, which slopes in only one direction. This barn illustrates a monitor roof, which is characterized by a taller gable roof with lower shed roofs on both the side walls. A half monitor roof has two shed roofs at different heights and sloping in opposite directions. This one has windows in between the two roofs, but that's not always the case. The sides of the roof are hard to see, so I drew in white lines so you could understand the shape a little better. A hip roof has four sloping sides that come together in the center. It can be either rectangular or square. A gamma roof has two different sloping angles on two sides. As with the gable roof, the side walls are shorter and the end walls go all the way up to meet the roof peak. This photo is of the Poor Farm Barn in Leelanau County. There are different types of curved rafter roofs. This one is a Gothic arch, which has a defined roof peak or ridge line, and then slopes down on a curve on two sides till it meets the sidewalls. I'd like to say that this wonderful photo is by Jim Mulvaney, one of our board members, who puts together our calendars and takes many of the photos as well, which is a lot of work. This curved rafter roof is called round roof because there is no definable ridge or roof peak from the outside. Another type of curved rafter is the OGEE, which actually has two curves as the roof slopes down to the sidewalls. One at the top curving inward and then curving outward the rest of the way. Though this one has a third curve at the bottom called a flared eave, but that could be on any other roof shape. This curved rafter roof doesn't really have another definition that I'm aware of, but because it's a rectangular barn, the curved rafters are brought together with a seemingly flat or low sloped roof in the center. Now we're on to foundation types. This one is on grade, which is built level with the ground. The barn doors are also at grade level. Piers can be simply large boulders, concrete posts, blocks, or bricks elevating a building a few inches to 2 feet off of the ground. This barn is raised and ramped, which means that it was built on grade, but with a distinct lower level or basement and an upper floor. This one has an earthen ramp to gain access to the drive floor. This is a bank barn on the left. It's built into a hillside, allowing access to a lower level on the downhill side and a level above on the uphill side. A bridged barn is built with a ramp that is hollow under the portion next to the foundation. The space below may be open or closed in. It's hard to see, but the bridge on the right is closed in with a door and window underneath, while the bridge on the left is open. Now we're going back to the roofs to look at roof coverings. Asphalt shingles on the right here vary in shapes, made with an asphalt base covered with mineral granules of varying color and texture. Wood shingles are the original roof covering material on most early Michigan barns. Individual sawn shingles, 12 to 16 inches long, taper from very thin at the top to between 1/4 to 3/8 inch thick at the exposed ends. Widths are random from 3 to 12 inches wide. Applied in parallel rows, the shingles cover the joints between the shingles below. Here's Jack teaching us how to make ropes. And check out the roof. Ribbed steel is the most modern of the roofing materials defined here, sometimes called pole building steel. It can be used as roofing or siding in new construction or covering old roofs or siding. It's made of sheets of steel formed with parallel rows of ridges 8 to 12 inches apart. It comes pre-painted in a variety of colors. Corrugated steel comes in sheets, usually galvanized, shaped in parallel furrows and ridges, giving a rippled effect. It typically covers an earlier wood or asphalt shingle roof. It may appear dull gray in color if the zinc plating, called galvanizing, is still intact. It may be partly or totally rusted. If painted with aluminum paint, it will look bright and silvery. Painting a metal roof that has begun to rust will extend its life by many years. Standing seam is an older type of galvanized steel roofing, most often used as a second or third roof covering. It may be dull gray, rusted, or painted. The seams are 1 inch tall, perpendicular to the ridge, and approximately 20 inches apart. Now for foundation materials. We have boulders, which are large field stones set into the earth at building corners and beneath interior support posts. Here's Claire teaching us about the foundation. Plain field stones are rounded and irregularly sized stones as found in the field, set in lime or cement mortar. Split field stones are also set in mortar with the flat sides facing outward. Dressed field stones are split and further shaped into blocks of relatively uniform size and shape. Poured concrete forms a foundation wall of uniform texture with no joint lines. The surface may vary from very smooth to rough and pebbly, which is kind of what you see here on the left. You may also be able to see evidence of the formwork that was used to hold the concrete in place as it cured or dried, as shown to the right. Glazed tiles are clay tiles with a shiny glaze in a wide variety of colors, dark red to creamy yellow, sometimes two-toned. Concrete blocks are made with coarse sand aggregate and formed into hollow core building blocks, approximately 8 inches high and 16 inches long. Laid with mortar, they form foundations or walls. Sometimes sometimes blocks have a decorative surface shown here. Concrete blocks are also called cement block or mistakenly cinder block, as very few are actually made with cinder, especially here in Michigan. Now we're switching to siding types. I was on a mission to find a photo of a barn with 100% black walls. I found this on the Michigan Old Barns Facebook page. According to Steve, it's stamped steel sheets to look like rock-faced cement blocks that were made to look like dressed stone. Here's an example of real concrete block with the same definition that I had previously mentioned. Corrugated steel is often used in modern silos, but you can also see it used vertically on the side of this building behind the vegetation. Rib steel is used as the siding on this barn-turned house. Bricks are fired clay building blocks in a variety of colors laid with mortar, and they can also be painted. Here's a barn I found on Michigan Old Barns Facebook page in Ogemaw County, showing a wonderful use of plain fieldstone walls. This outbuilding in the center has tar paper for siding, which is usually used as roofing underlayment. On either side, it looks like the buildings have asbestos shingles. Wood is the most common, and here we're looking at vertical boards that are long, wide, usually 1 inch thick, nailed on vertically. Board and batten is another vertical wood application with narrow boards nailed over the gaps of the vertical siding. For horizontal wood siding, thin boards are applied with the bottom of the one board lapped over the top of the one below. This photo is showing tongue and groove, where the joint between the boards appears as a groove along the length of the board. It's usually in 6 or 8 inch panels. Less common, we see wood shingles, seen here on the left, as well as log barns. This one here is part of the Pioneer Village Museum in Bad Axe. This barn in Romeo I thought was cool because its structure is exposed with the siding in between. Finally, we have barn features. This photo shows the deep overhang at the roof ridge called a hay hood or turkey tail. Here's one of our Barn of the Year winners showing us 2 cupolas. A cupola is a wooden roofed structure mounted on the roof ridge that ventilates the upper part of the building. Sometimes cupolas are non-functional and just decorative. If you have a barn that you would like to nominate for Barn of the Year, go to our website and we're accepting entries until February 1st. Showing us its ventilator is the barn at Evergreen Farms in Ogama County. Now it's a wedding venue. A ventilator is a metal factory-built structure attached to the ridge of a roof, and it ventilates the building. Lightning rods are slim, vertical metal rods attached to the ridge of a roof, the top of cupolas or ventilators. They direct current underground. Some are ornate with a weather vane or glass spheres like this barn's at Mayberry Farm. Here Steve is leading us through our first barn school. Dormers are roofed projections from the main surface of the roof, usually with a window, door, or vent. An overshoot, also called a forebay, is a method of construction whereby the upper floor is extended over the foundation on the downhill side of a barn. Most commonly found in bank barns, the overshoot may be supported by the foundation on the ends or may be completely unsupported. They range in depth and may have had supplementary supports added to compensate for failing footings or framing members. This one is the Firestone Barn at Greenfield Village. It's an example of an overshoot supported at the ends with brackets. However, it's technically not a Michigan barn because it was moved here from Pennsylvania. A pent roof is a shed roof projecting from a wall having no other support. They can be very small to shelter a door or quite large to provide shelter for farm activity. CLERESTORY windows are very high above the floor as seen here. You also see them in monitor and half monitor roofs. Transom windows are a single row of windows directly above a door or window. A weather vane is a device attached to a building that indicates wind direction, often mounted on a lightning rod or ventilators shown here. Now this is a unique barn in Port Austin where the corners are chamfered. If anyone has any idea about this technique, please let us know because we are stumped. And I'm sure you've all seen the barn quilts as they have become very popular. This one is a part of the Thumb Quilt Trail. You can find links to this and a whole list of other quilt trails around Michigan on our website. And we have that link in the chat box. And that is it. Any questions?
All right, thank you so much, Stephanie. We have had some questions come in and I am going to save some of the general questions till the end when we have everyone participate. But there is a question, what is the purpose of transform windows or transom?
Transom, well, I don't know for sure, but maybe it would be like if it were above a door, then it could let light in even though the door is closed. If it's above another window, probably just to get the sun coming from at a different angle if it wouldn't normally come in the window. But that's a good question. I don't know, I'll have to look into that.
All right, perfect. So the other questions might be answered in some of our other presentations. So we're gonna hang on to those. And so Steve, if you are able to start your screen share and turn your video on. We will move into, Steve is going to cover the evolution and history of Michigan barns. And then go to slideshow. And then go to slideshow, Steve, and you can hit right next to review and animations in your toolbar.
You're not seeing my slide?
I am seeing your slide, but you're not in presentation mode. So if you go to like where it says home, if you go across a couple to slideshow and click slideshow.
Okay, for start.
Yep, perfect. And then Steve, if you want to share your video, you are welcome to, or you can just begin your presentation.
I thought I said it, but I guess I'm not on. Okay. All right.
If you go to your toolbar at the bottom and you click the video, it should start your video. I think you turned it off while Stephanie was presenting.
Right. I thought I turned it back on.
Oh, no problem.
Okay.
We can hear you. So take it away. Steve is going to cover the evolution of barns in Michigan, and then Tamis is going to wrap us up with some maintenance tips and tricks that we can use when working with these structures. So, all right, Steve.
All right. Oh, wait. Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. If we can make it through this without another disaster, I guess we can prove that old dogs can learn new tricks. There we go. Look at that. I've been observing and studying and working on old barns for about 25 years. And much of what I've learned is from talking to people about their own experiences and knowledges about barns. In doing this, I learned that there's no standard language to talk about barns. A barn feature named one thing in one region may be named something completely different a few counties over. I hope this presentation will begin to distill and consolidate some terms used to describe barns and barn features. And I hope this presentation today will be an opportunity for us to continue the conversation about barns and have you share your barn knowledge and experiences with us. So I'd like to have you make as many comments as you can. In learning the language or trying to consolidate language about barns, I think it's good to know what barns we're talking about. A lot of people call them historic barns or heritage barns. Some call them just old barns, but I like the word traditional because it supports their barns that supported traditional agriculture. And my thinking of traditional agriculture existed in Michigan from sometime in the 19th century, and it continued up until the middle of the 20th century. And they were, from the time people settled land in Michigan and started farms, they were always small, from 40 acres on up. They were always family operated. They were diversified in that they had some cows and they had chickens and they had hogs and they raised oats and corn and wheat. So they were diversified in their, in what they did. They were mostly subsistence farms, especially to begin with. And it wasn't until later that the farms became a little bit more commercial. They were, they had human scale power. In other words, in the very beginning, it was just people power along with oxen and horses. And even after the turn of the century, when we began to have tractors, the teens and 20s and 30s had tractors that had very small horsepower. So the farmers could imagine what a horsepower was. They knew what a team could do. And so it was something that they could understand the power of those small tractors in the very beginning. They had low chemical use and low or no credit. This is what's described as an English style barn. And the word English is unfortunate because it doesn't describe anything about the barn. It's better to describe a building by its characteristic parts and features. In this case, the features are that it's English style barns were fairly small. They had a gable roof. They were timber framed. They had 3 bays. And so that was the very basic early barns in Michigan in the early settlement period. It's unfortunate that they were called English style barns because I think other nationalities that had farms in Michigan had the same type of barn. And this is a painting by Charles Lehman, and it was painted during the first quarter of the 19th century, and it's of the LaSalle farmstead on the River Raisin. And so this, if you can see the barn there behind the house, is actually what we would normally call an English style barn, and it points out the downside of naming barns after the people that actually built them in the beginning.
Steve, before you go further, could you define a bay?
Sure. On this slide, I'll back up one. On this slide here, can you see my pointer? The sections of the barn are divided.
There you go. Yep, we can see the English style.
This old dog is working on its new tricks here.
Great.
This section here between the door and this end is a bay, and then the center bay, sometimes called the thrashing bay, or the drive floor is in the center, and then there's another bay on the other side. Once we begin to talk about what the inside of the barn looks like, this is where the framing members are, is at the end, at the end of the first bay, at the end of the second bay, and then at the far end. So each one of these sections is called a bay, and this would be a 3-bay barn. And again, here we go back to this painting of a French farm on the River Raisin. They have this 3 bays barn gable roof in the background. So this is a French barn, even though we would normally call it an English style barn. English style barns were the basic barn on most pioneer farms in Michigan, and as the farmers increased their farming and they needed more room, you can see this one has a log barn in the background, and they have an English style barn in the foreground. And then to increase its capacity, they've added a shed with a shed roof on the end, which was very common. And at times they would, you know, here's a case where there are two barns and they would just add a second barn, or you can see on this one has an added bay, at least one added bay to the barn. And so that was an easy way to increase the capacity of these English style barns. They said English style barns could also be increased in capacity by building over a basement. And in this case, if the basement was built into a hillside, it's called a bank barn. And here's another English style barn that it's not built into a hillside necessarily, but they built an earthen ramp to allow access to the upper floor. So I'd like to distinguish between the two by saying this is a ramped barn and it has an earthen ramp to get into the second level of the barn, as opposed to a bank barn. And eventually this form of the English style barn developed into a really fairly large capacity barn throughout the 19th century. One other distinctive style of barn in Michigan is a Dutch style. The early Dutch settled in and farmed in the Hudson River Valley, and they built Dutch style barns in the 17th century. So that was long before we had barns in Michigan. The Dutch people came to Michigan on the west side of Michigan in the 1840s. Albertus van Raalte led a group of Dutch immigrants to Michigan in 1847, and they founded the Holland Colony, and the barns that were eventually built in that area took this form, just like the barns in the Hudson Valley. The characteristics of a Dutch style barn is that they have a transverse frame, they have a gable end entry, they have low eaves, and 3 bays usually. So that's the definition of Dutch style barns in Michigan. Traveled down to the Holland area to look at some Dutch style barns, and they were all over. And the one thing that they all have in common is the end entry. And so that's really different than most other barns in Michigan. All of the gambrel roof barns and the English style barns will all have a door on the eave side. Dutch style barns have this characteristics of the entry door on the gable end. There's another, this is a Timmers family farm that we visited. And again, it has transverse frame, gable entry, and then eaves are fairly low to the ground. The one characteristics from the earlier Dutch barns that persisted was the end entry. And here we see a gambrel roof end entry. And these are quite common in the Holland area, in the counties around Holland. But you'll seldom see a barn like this in other parts of Michigan. There's another gambrel roof barn with an end entry. So these Dutch style barns and English style barns persisted through the 19th century, but at around the turn of the century, which means give or take at least 10 years, around 2000, a lot of changes came in about that time. First of all, gambrel roofs became the new style barn. As farmers were raising more hay, they needed a lot more area in in the mow to store hay. Plank frame barns started to take over from heavy timber frame barns because there was thought that they used less lumber. They were easier to erect. Silos were first introduced in Michigan, and they became common in Michigan starting around the turn of the century. Portland cement, which had been around in some places for a long time, was really gaining popularity. So poured concrete, Portland cement is an essential ingredient in concrete. So it allowed poured concrete walls, and also wire nails. Before wire nails came in around the turn of the century, square cut nails were in use during the 19th century. Now here's a typical gambrel roof barn. This one is built on a basement of, it looks like bricks. And because it's built on grade on level ground, this would be called a basement barn. Many people, instead of calling this barn a gambrel, call this a hip roof barn, which is a misnomer. And I wanted to show you the difference. This is a gambrel roof barn, and this is a hip roof. The definition of a hip roof is that each section of the roof, it pitches down to the eaves of the building. So it's really quite different than a gambrel roof. One of the things about gambrel roofs is that the shape of the actual gambrel is widely varied. And so they are different shapes. Every one is slightly different, and the different angles are quite widely varied. This is the Holy Cow Farm barn in Okemos. Here's a gambrel roof barn, but the change in pitches is so slight that you have to wonder how much actual space that they gained. I have a suspicion that a lot of times barns that were built at the round of the turn of the century, because gambrel roof shape was more modern, that a lot of barns were just built with a gambrel roof, because it was fashionable at the time. And you got to wonder how much extra storage space that they gained with this roof. To make things even more complicated, there are a few of these roofs in Michigan. There are not very many, and they're scattered around different places, but it has 3 pitches on each side. As I said, they're not very many, and they're hard to find, but they're out there. And this one has a dormer, has 2 dormers, and it has lightning rods and a flared eave. One other thing that changed at the beginning of the 20th century was farmers started looking around for different types of barn construction, because heavy timbers were beginning to be less easy to find, and to raise a timber frame barn took a lot of more labor than what lighter weight construction did. One of the people that was champion of the plank frame barns, is what they're called, was John Shaver, and he published this book in 1904. And Shaver not only was a proponent of plank frame barns, but he also designed what I call a Shaver type truss. And it was made up of laminated posts and braces all nailed together. And it's defined by braces that begin at the bottom of a post and go upward at an angle towards the purlin, and from the top of the post up at an angle to the peak. And then there are smaller braces in between to make it a rigid structure. Because it was right at the turn of the century, one of the buildings in Shawver's book was a Shawver truss with a gable roof. And so this was thought at the time to be kind of an old-fashioned thing, but he included it in his book, a gable roof barn. And there's still a lot of these out there in Michigan, and we see this one, a fairly large barn, and it is actually a T-shaped barn. And this is the Ottawa County Poor Farm Barn, but this has been on several tours that we've been on, and so it was thought of as a real modern, large hay barn. The other type of roof that became popular is called what I call a curved rafter barn. And some of the early curved rafter barns were started in Clare County and the northern part of Isabella County. And we have a record of some of them being built as early as 1895. This shape of barn we'll call Gothic because it's more pointed than it is round. This one, as Stephanie mentioned, is an OGEE. This one in particular, it makes the barn look really quite fancy with the two cupola on the top. And it shows that some farmers were really kind of showy and were more than happy to show off their aesthetic appeal. Then if a round roof barn is more circular or round, we like to call it a round barn instead of just a curved rafter barn. So if it's more round than pointed, it's a round barn roof. If it's more pointed than it is round, then it's a Gothic. Then as far as the shapes or the footprint of a barn, there were quite a few round barns in Michigan. The numbers have been dwindling for a long time. This barn is the Ficuma Round Barn in Osceola County. This barn is in Lenawee County near Palmyra. It's gone now. I visited this barn about 12 or 15 years ago. And at that time, it was what I considered to be still savable and still could have been repaired, but it didn't take very long. There were holes in the roof and it actually fell down within a short time when I was there. Have multi-sided barns. The most famous one in Michigan, at least, is the Gagetown barn, which Stephanie had a really great picture of that. But multi-sided barns, they can have any number of sides greater than 4. And they're lumped together with round barns in what's called non-orthogonal barns, which means that the sides don't meet at right angles. Beginning in about 1918, there are 2 companies that sold kit barns. One is Gordon Van Tyne, that had been a barn equipment manufacturer for some time, and Sears and Roebuck, who also sold barn equipment in their catalog. There may have been other companies that sold these kits. I don't know, maybe some of you can help me out with that. But they're the only ones that I have been able to find. And if you look at these catalogs, the shape and sizes of the barns look so familiar that I'm suspicious that there was only one company that actually produced the kits, and Gordon Van Tyne and Sears basically sold these people, whoever manufactured them, their manufactured the kits. Some of you probably have more information about this than I, and I'd love to hear from you so I can fill in the gaps. There were other companies that made barn equipment, such as ventilators, dairy equipment, door track hardware. They made all kinds of specialty metal equipment for barns. And they also had a service where they would have somebody come out to your barn and they would instruct the farmer on what he needed to do to either improve his barn or have a new one built. They didn't necessarily sell kits, but they sold the idea that their barn could be improved or brought up to date. And of course, they sold their equipment to go in it. Jamesway, this is a Jamesway catalog from 1927, and it shows the progression of different barn shapes and sizes right there in the, you have a timber frame at the top, then a timber frame gambrel, and then a plank frame gambrel, and then a curved rafter barn at the bottom. And they're, the people that they would send out to help the farmers would advise on what kind of barn they could use. Loudon was another barn equipment manufacturer and supplier. They also sold plans for barns, and they'd also send a person out to visit your barn and tell you how it could be improved or remodeled, and also to use their equipment. Here's a nice looking barn that has ventilators and lightning rods, a hay hood, lots of windows. It's most likely this is a dairy barn. But from the outside, the point I'd like to make is that this could very well be a kit barn, or it could be a timber frame barn, or it could be a plank frame barn. It could even be a shove or truss barn. The point is, from the outside, you can tell very little about how the barn is framed and how it was built. You have to see the inside to know what the barn is really about. As I said, traditional farms basically started going out of business in about the middle of the 20th century. And this was an extension circular from MSU Extension in 1955 for laminated rafters or curved rafter barns. It's interesting to note that at the same time, the authors of this extension bulletin or circular, J.S. Boyd was at the same time promoting what people call pole barns. I don't give them the respect that they're pole barns. I call them pole buildings. So this is kind of the end of the big hay barns at the middle of the 20th century. All right, that's the end of my part of the presentation. Thank you all for joining us today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. We have a lot of questions coming in, but I want to make sure that Tamis has time to get through her section. So we might end up going a little bit long, but if you are able to stick around with us, we'd be happy to have you. Otherwise, if your question does get answered and you have to hop off, catch it in the YouTube recording. So Tamis, if you want to share your presentation, because I'm sure we have a lot of people with barns who are probably waiting with bated breath to find out what they can do to help their barn.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, thanks for coming to Virtual Barn School 101, the exterior. So I'm going to talk about barn maintenance. And now that we've learned or refreshed our knowledge about barn terminology and the history and evolution of barns, it's time to talk about barn maintenance and conducting a condition report. So this is a check sheet that Steve and Stephanie created to take along with your barn maintenance walkthrough. And then on the right is a barn school booklet that is a good reference material for your checklist. And some of that includes the vocabulary and history of barns that we've been going through. So if you look at the check sheet, you can go across the top of the check sheet and you can identify what type of barn that you have and the shape of it, and then go down the side column, or it talks about the exterior and the different definitions and types of aspects of your barn. And then in each elevation, you can check on the condition of that. So it's a nice check sheet for you to have. So it's time to get your check sheet in hand and your pencil and take a walk around your barn. First subject matter is elevations. Does your barn have bulges and dips to it? Look at all the elevations and decipher if the barn is leading, if the roof has a dip, are their walls plumb and straight? Is there a foundation? Do all this at all the elevations and mark it on your check sheet. Second subject matter is vegetation. Does your barn have vegetation growing on it? Vines, trees, bushes leaning on or growing over and out of the barn? This is a good DIY project. Third subject matter is drainage. Does the barn have good drainage? Does the earth slope away or towards the barn? You want to make sure it slopes away. Are there broken gutters or downspouts? Can you clean them out or repair them? This is another good DIY project depending on the condition and location. So now is a good time to take a break that we just got started and talk about safety. Buildings can be dangerous even if they've been neglected a long time, but they can also be dangerous if they've never been neglected. Always be aware of your surroundings. Be careful walking around, using ladders, power tools, and equipment. Remember to bring your cell phone with you in case you need help, or a buddy system would be even better. So I'm going to talk about a few examples, but first let's do a quick recap. First, for your barn, check for dips, humps, missing pieces of your building, and take notes. Remove close vegetation from the barn, such as trees, branches, and vines. Provide good drainage from the roof down to the ground and slope away from the barn. Use safety measures, doing all of the above. Sometimes it's a fine line between maintenance and repair, such as the stone repointing picture on the left could be considered maintenance. Definitely the timber sill replacement on the right would be considered a repair. I'm going to talk about a few examples and how it relates to the condition check sheet. This first example I call good intentions. This is a 3-bay gable-roofed carriage barn in Oakland Township. The good intention was to install a temporary roof with plastic tarp. You can see that the vegetation is growing up the side of the carriage barn and the tree limb is overhanging on the roof. The barn sits directly on grade and the positive drainage is not great. The rear of the structure of this carriage barn was compromised when a rock and roll band took off the siding and infill studs for a bandstand. With good intentions, the mothball program did not hold up. The carriage barn was documented with photos and measurements before demolition. The repair was actually a reconstruction. This is a reconstruction of the carriage barn based on the documentation that was performed before the demolition. The next example I call the stone foundation falls in, a great fear when you walk out to your barn. This is a 5-bay timber frame gabled roof bank barn in Oakland Township. Due to grading issues, the water penetrated the stone mortar joints, and without maintenance, the foundation eventually failed. The roof had 2 layers of asphalt shingles on top of the original cedar shingle roof. All had reached the end of their lifespan. Because of the timber frame skeletal structure, even without the majority of the foundation, the barn is still standing. It is still straight and plumb, and the ridge is straight across. Repair. A new foundation was installed. All of the shingles were removed down to the original skip sheathing, and a new Sheriff Gosling diamond-shaped asphalt roof was installed. The next example I call the cupola blew off. This is a gambrel roof on a grade barn with board and batten siding at Oakland University. The cupola blows off. They attempt to patch it with the blue tarp, and then the blue tarp fails. The cedar shingles are original and failing, as you can see daylight when you are inside the barn. There are drainage problems. A road was constructed near the barn, and the earth sloped towards the barn. Also, the barn sits at ground level, and the board and batten siding touched the ground. The good news is that there was not any overgrowth of vegetation at this barn. The repair included raising the grade around the barn a bit, raising the floor level of the barn to keep the siding off. A new cedar shingle roof went on, reconstructed cupola, and the barn was painted. The barn originally was a part of the Meadowbrook farm owned by Matilda Dodge Wilson. Mrs. Wilson donated her mansion, the farm buildings, and land to Oakland University. The new signage reflects the heritage. The barn is also a 2016 Barn of the Year Award winner. We recommend that you do an annual barn check. Even if you're at your barn every day, we recommend doing an annual barn review to check the condition of your barn and document it. Pick a date that's good for you. Maybe it's your birthday. Keep an eye on things. As you can see at this timber sill, this is a classic area where things start to fail. So you might not be able to make the repair this year or next year, but if you keep an eye on it, you'll know when the time has arrived. Sometimes a project is beyond what you're able to do. Be safe and hire a pro, a skilled tradesperson. On our Michigan Barn Preservation Network contact page, we receive a lot of questions. A popular question is, are there any grants for barn repairs? There is always exceptions to the rule, but the answer is basically no, unfortunately. The Michigan Barn Preservation Network does not have any grant program, but we are here to service you the best we can. That concludes the exterior guide to maintenance. I know you have a lot of questions, and we would certainly love to have a dialogue. So on behalf of the Michigan Barn Preservation Network, we thank you and look forward to your questions.
Excellent. So we did have quite a few questions come in. And so we'll get started to keep the questions coming. And yeah, so we'll start at the top. So going back to the foundation materials, do we see drywall construction here in Michigan? So a foundation of fieldstone with no mortar. This individual ran into a wall without mortar out in Minnesota and was wondering if that also appears in Michigan.
I've never seen a drywall stone foundation. They've all had mortar. I mean, sometimes the mortar is deteriorated and it looks like it might be drywall, but it's not. So I haven't. Maybe Stephanie or Steve might have more information.
No, I have never seen, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. No, the dry stone walls are usually made from more flat stones. And the stones that we have in Michigan are all glaciated stones, and they're all round. And so I have never seen a dry stone wall in Michigan, no.
Okay, interesting. A question about function. So why are granaries always raised off of the ground?
Varmints, groundhogs, anything that wants to eat the granary.
The grain in the granary, right? Is moisture an issue as well? Like having it off the ground allows for air circulation. Does that also come into that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think air circulation has a lot to do with it. I think animals have a lot to do with it. Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, that's true. The slide that Stephanie showed of a granary was right close to the ground. And that's the one that we as our organization, dismantled that barn. But mostly granaries are up off in the ground to discourage rats and mice and other rodents that will eat the grain.
Perfect. Thank you. So a question regarding the barn colors, right? The red barn is the iconic image in everyone's mind when they think of barns. There were some blue barns and a light green barns. And yellow barns? Are there any historic colors that you all have come across or can discuss?
Well, there's always the big question of the red barn, and one of our members did a little research on the red barn. I can't recall what it is at the moment, but I think it's interesting that in Ohio, I mean, a lot of the barns are white in Ohio. So so red is classic, but it's not the ultimate in barn colors. That's my take on the color. I know Steve and Stephanie have more information. That's the beauty of the three panelists. Steve?
Well, people want to know about this, and almost everybody claims that farmers would mix, early on, they would mix their own paint using linseed oil and some pigment. And most people say that the pigment that they used was iron oxide or rust. But there's other pigments that make paint red. And lead still makes red paint. So there's red lead paint as well. There is a red that is traditional in the Scandinavian companies called Fallen Red. And I think as much as anything, a red color was what everybody used, and they didn't want to do anything different. The ones that you see that are green and white and yellow are people that wanted to just do something a little different.
Stephanie, do you have any thoughts about the color of a barn?
No, not really. I did hear something. Did it have to do with like the blood of the animals, the red, like making paint? I saw something on the Victorian farm where they were using it to make like ink for staining things, but I didn't know if that was also true about barns.
Interesting. Now, in the paint conversation, often now we see barns that are bare wood. Was that ever, were barns always coated and we're just seeing the result of a lack, like the paint has just worn off over time, or did some farmers just never paint those structures?
Yeah, never say never.
Never. Yeah. I think most of them were painted just by taking pictures of a lot of barns. Once you get close, you can see the remnants of paint, and just with years of neglect of a lot of barns, the paint has started to dissipate. But I'm sure there's a few people that said, heck with it, I'm not going to paint this barn. But a lot of it is just through the years and neglect, the paint has disappeared.
there were a lot of barns that were just not painted. You know, there was added expense and labor to paint a barn, and painting a barn is mostly for the color rather than the preservative. Painting a barn did make it last longer, but we're talking about in 100 years, it might have only lasted 85 instead of 100. So the paint does preserve a barn, but it has to be put on every 10 or 15 years. But there were a lot of barns in our area that just were not painted.
Interesting. A question about the foundation. This individual has a barn, and the foundation of the barn has fieldstone on the inside and cobblestone on the outside. And is that a usual combination?
It depends on what they had in the fields. You know, all the field stones came from the fields around the barn, and one definition of cobblestones are ones that you can hold in one hand. So that's the size of a cobblestone, and then field stones can be of any size. I haven't really noticed. I don't think I've seen one that was distinctly cobblestones on the inside and field stones on the outside. So it had more to do with the builder or the farmer and what size of stones he had available.
Right, using what's in the surroundings. Can you talk about adding gutters that don't take away from the aesthetic appeal of the barn itself? And are gutters recommended for a barn, talking about like water management and water infiltration?
Well, gutters on any building are a big debate, because if you don't maintain the gutter, then it sometimes causes more trouble than it's actually helping. So, and then if you have a barn that's, you know, 2 stories tall, then it can be difficult to clean them because they're so far up, and you got to have a long ladder to get at them. So it's nice to have gutters if you're able to maintain the gutters, but if you can't, then you have to maintain the water that's being shed from the roof at the ground level. So you can have means of doing that with just how you treat the ground level. And you could have like pea gravel around the base of the building that will help not totally eliminate the splash up, but at least will help with that. So typical answer, it depends. I think mainly, and if you have a traditional barn, then it could be that a half round gutter would look more appropriate on the building than the K style of gutters that are around so typical today. So if you've got a barn that is an old barn, it seems like a half round gutter would be appropriate if you can in fact clean the gutters. But maybe you don't need a ladder. Maybe you've got a cherry picker and you can zip around and clean your gutters that way.
Interesting. That's
but there's a lot of barns that we've seen that the gutters don't get cleaned out, and then they clog up. And then the gutter downspout becomes clogged up, and then it starts dripping on the corner of the building, and then you've got the corner of the timber frame that starts to rot. So it can get really bad. But
the most important thing is your grade around the barn, and make sure it slopes away so that water that comes off from the roof drains away from the barn. So that's the most important thing. I personally don't care for gutters, but if you have to have them, make sure that they're well maintained and they drain away from the barn as well.
Right. And that goes back to Tamas's, discussion of some of the easiest ways that you as a barn owner can maintain your building is checking for that water infiltration, right? With a wooden structure, that's the biggest threat to it, and that can be from grading. I was given the tip once to go out in the rain and look around your building so you can see like how the water is shedding off your the structure and checking that.
That's great advice. Yeah.
Process. And yeah, the individual who asked the gutter question was just followed up saying they were concerned about water getting into the foundation and cracking the foundation. So talking about the grade, right, of the...
Right, yeah, just keep that grade sloping away from the, sometimes it's easier said than done. Like the barn at Oakland University, everything was sloping towards it, so it was not an easy feat. But if you've got, if you can, do it. I mean, you might have to bring extra dirt in or some gravel to get that slope away from your barn.
Very good. A question about just how many barns we have in Michigan. Do we have an estimate of how many traditional barns are remaining in Michigan?
No. When Jack Worthington was still alive, he and I would ride around and look at barns, and one day we decided to try to determine how many barns there were. That question ended up being part of our Michigan Barn and Farmstead survey, where we try to get volunteers to go out and not only count the barns, but document what they are and other farm buildings. There are some counties have already been completed, and they had a lot of barns and a surprising number. But you have to remember that we have 83 counties in Michigan and 1,240 some townships. Each township is 36 square miles. So if you start doing the numbers, there are still a lot of them out there. The greatest number were probably at the highest peak of small farms in Michigan was around 1910. And so that's when we probably had the most, and we've been losing them ever since. And so how many there are left today, we really don't know. But, so, you know, many, many thousands.
Is there a way to access the surveys that you were just talking about, the counties that were completed?
That's another good question. Our Barn and Farmstead survey was begun at a time when we didn't have cell phones, and the archives were still wanting black and white photographs for documentation. So it was about 1993 when we started. At a certain point, we tried to get it to be a searchable database for the barns, and it's still in the hands of a division of Michigan State University called Matrix. We still don't have satisfactory searching capabilities from there. So everything about that is on hold. You can go online on our website. There is a place that people can go to and see a video presentation about the survey and see what it's all about. But as far as tracking, researching barns, it's pretty tenuous at this time.
Sure. Sure. And I guess as we're talking about documentation of rural structures, it might be a helpful tool to bring up the rural property inventories that were created during the Depression, right?
Yes.
Which not all counties have had those results archived, correct? But the state archive has quite a few counties that are accessible via online search.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a link on our website to that.
Perfect, perfect. We'll share that in the resources as well.
Okay.
So those who are looking for some documentation, sometimes those are, you can get lucky and you can find your property documented in the 1930s, what it was like. In a question in talking about numbers and documentation, what is the most farm buildings or outbuildings that you've seen on one property? This individual says that they know of a property with like 11 outbuildings. So how many outbuildings? What's the property with the most outbuildings that you've seen? The most maintenance?
I can't think of any, but I know my cousin who are blueberry farmers in the Fenville area. I swear that some farmers just like to build during the off season, because he's like, he's built a couple goat barns. He's built the main barn. He's built the maple sugar shack. He's built the garden shed. So sometimes I think people just like to build things, and that's why you find a lot of buildings.
Right. I don't think it would be surprising to see somewhere between 5 and 10 buildings on a traditional farm, especially because they had a lot of specialized buildings then.
Right, right. Stephanie, can you think of a property with a lot of outbuildings?
No, I mean, I have seen a lot, but it's hard to tell where one farm starts and another begins sometimes. So,
right.
The one slide that Stephanie had of an aerial view of a farm had, we didn't count them, but I would say there's probably 6 or 8 or 9 buildings in that picture.
mm-hmm.
Right. And of course, we don't know what has been lost over
Exactly.
time and that sort of thing. With early farms being diversified, and as we're talking about the outbuildings, there's so many different types for specific uses. Do you often find clues that one outbuilding was changed over time or converted into a new use? And what is this common? Is that something that people might be able to see in their own properties?
Well, okay, so I'll say that I think there are some telling signs, like how Steve mentioned in one of the barns that he thought was a dairy barn because there were a lot of windows. So, or like how I mentioned with the hog barn, there might be like little doors or chicken coops. So those kinds of features might give away, like if the animal was really small to get through a small door or needed large windows. So that would be one way to see why it was maybe originally built.
You can observe this all the time. The Poor Farm Barn in Leelanau County was changed right after the turn, well, soon after it was built, because the dairy herd grew a little bit and they added a silo, and at the same time they added the stanchion equipment, and all of these things were provided by the companies that manufactured Jamesway, Starline, Loudon, and all those people were offering that kind of equipment, and so that usually marked a change in what the farmer was doing.
Sure. I mean, one example of a converted use is sometimes I've seen the carriage house converted into a garage, right? So exactly. They'll remove the sliding doors and maybe put in a raised door, and you'll see that altered. So there are some buildings, right, that change use over time, and you can kind of see that. We're almost done with our questions. So but we are getting close to our 2:30 end time. So if you have to, I just want to do a brief thank you again. If you have to hop off right at 2:30, thank you for attending. We hope you have enjoyed it. You will receive an email with a link to the recording and all of the resources that we have talked about today, and a few more I'm sure we'll think of to share with you. So if you forgot to save the chat, you will receive one of those. And yeah, if you are able to stick around and you have more questions, our panel has been so gracious in offering to stick around longer. So we have a few more that we'll be wrapping up with. So going back to our questions, one individual said that they have a barn roof that has been described as a double gable. Have you heard that term used? And she said she didn't see that reflected in any of the photographs. So this might be a one that needs to follow up with an email to the barn network with a photograph.
A photograph would help. It's hard to say. Never heard.
Yeah, I haven't heard that term either. So we'd need to see a photograph to know what that is.
All right. And we'll include, I mean, the Barn Preservation Network has a website with contact information. We'll also include contact information in our one pager and with those resources. And so if you have any follow-up questions, you want to send pictures, again, the panel has been very gracious in saying that they're happy to look and be of assistance however they can. So we did have someone who went to the Barn Preservation Network to copy all of the links to the survey. So I just sent that to all the attendees as well again. And there were a few questions in the chat. So I'm just making sure we got all of that. We have someone who said they had a property that had 6 outbuildings in Smith's Creek. And another individual who had noted that they had lived on 2 different properties with barns, and both barns have since been lost, which is unfortunate. So there's an individual who said they have several maintenance concerns about their property. They don't have much building experience, and they're looking for help diagnosing those problems. So it sounds like something a little bit bigger than what we've talked about with removing vegetation, looking at grade, preventing water infiltration. Can you point them in the right direction to maybe finding that professional that you discussed, Tanis?
Well, actually, this is kind of how this all started. Steve Steyer decided that we needed really a base to have, that we could train people to do these barn condition surveys. So that was really what our first barn schools were about, just training people to go out and analyze a building. So depending on where they are, I mean, they could follow their own checklist, or they could hire somebody to guide them through that checklist. And so depending on where they are, they could maybe contact us and we can send them to the right person. But that was really the start of barn school, was training people to do a condition report of barns.
If I'm remembering correctly, there is a list of contractors that is on the Michigan Barn Preservation Network.
Yep, we have a list, and so, quite a few of them have gone through the barn school and are able and ready to do these condition reports. I just know that a lot of contractors are really busy, so you might, it takes a while to kind of get on their list. And we are, by the way, we are looking for people who are interested in becoming barn contractors, because a lot of barn contractors have retired, and we need to bring in new people who are willing and able to learn the trade.
Right, right.
And Steve has volunteered to work on some of that internship for learning the trade.
Excellent. Well, we'll include Steve's information for those who know someone who wants to get into that trade. I think there was one more. Oh, so with so many similarities of barn types in certain areas, how were the barns built? And then kind of a follow-up, is it common builders who were hired? And then I think this came in before the barn kits, which came up. But do you have any thoughts on the communal or the building of some of these barn types?
What I've kind of decided is that almost every county, or maybe 2 in every county, there were builders. And then there were builders that specialized in building barns, especially timber frames. And then when you got to plank frame barns, then regular carpenters could, nail the 2-bys together and erect a barn that way. So it was a lot less complicated, and it opened up the actual construction of the barn to more people. Does that answer the question? So
I think it was more of an interesting musing on how some of these barns and areas all tend to look similar.
All right, so that it also, having 1 or 2 builders in a county they probably built barns the same. So you'll have either one or two different types of barns from those builders.
Yeah, interesting. Have you ever seen a cobblestone floor in the lower level of a barn?
I never have.
Hi, Lori. I don't think I've ever seen a cobblestone floor. I've seen a lot of wood floors, and some high-end barns had a cork floor or a wooden floor with sections of 4x4s or 4x6s set on end together. And that was to relieve the stresses on the animals that walked on it. So I've never seen cobblestones. It seems like that would be a terrible thing to try to clean.
Yeah, I'm imagining trying to lead certain animals across a cobblestone floor. That's interesting. We're getting into a few more technical questions. So these might be ones that we'll have to follow up with the individuals afterwards. And looking for sources of wood windows or alternative modern windows that look like wood, and also barn doors. So where do you, if someone needs to replace materials, do you have any suggestions, or is that, I mean, that's a regional thing, right? Availability of stores.
Well, actually, I mean, yeah, Steve will go into this more detail, but surprisingly, you know, I've gone to Menards and looked through some of the, I mean, they have wood barn sash windows that are wood. So you still can get some stock material. And then there are people who repair wood windows too, that Steve did a workshop, and other people have done this workshop as well. So there are people, well, as you know, Mallory. So there's definitely people who repair wood windows, and you can still buy wood windows. And as far as the doors, I think the doors are more of a custom made, but I mean, you could hire a good carpenter to have some of those doors rebuilt. But Steve would know more about that, so I handed it back over to Steve.
Yeah, older windows were made so that they could be repaired. So if you have old barn windows, there are people around that can repair them, and it's not that difficult to repair them yourself. So I would suggest that you think about repairing windows, and then or repairing them yourself, or hiring somebody to repair them.
Yeah, I mean, keeping the material the same, right, instead of putting in vinyl is usually better for the structure in the long term. I think
yes.
you all would agree.
Yes, we would agree.
It's just better all around.
Right. So we have had several people in the chat, and I'm keeping track of people's names who are talking about reaching out with further individual questions. And my email, I will put my email address right in the chat right now, but you will receive the follow-up email from my email with the Michigan Historic Preservation Network, and you can email me. We'll also include the contact information for Tamis, Stephanie, and Steve. They have been very gracious in offering for us to share that information. And we'll also include the contact information for the Michigan Barn Preservation Network. And they, I copied something from one of their members into the chat saying, like, they're always available to try to help as much as they can, right? And again, they are also a nonprofit organization, and so is the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. So if you want to become members to support this work that we, so that we can continue to offer these resources to everyone, our website is www.mhpn.org, and the Michigan Barn Preservation Network, I don't have your guys memorized off the top of my head, so I'm just looking that up real quick.
It's mibarn.net.
mibarn.net, which is easy enough. And of course, you can always Google mibarn.net. We have one more question that came in. And so a question about gaining access to suggestions for preserving an 1884 barn. Again, I'm gonna just, if you have specific or general questions at this point about a specific building, I would encourage you to reach out to the Michigan Barn Preservation Network, and we'll see how, they'll see how they can be of assistance to you. Whew, we got a lot covered in an hour and 40 minutes.
Thanks, Valerie, for keeping it going.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you all for sharing your time and expertise. Many years of experience. Tamis and Stephanie are architects, so they have a lot of experience working with buildings, and Steve has been doing trades training for many, many years and helping keep that going. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you all here this afternoon with us. Look for that follow-up email again, and it'll have all these information and a link to the recording if you want to catch this information a second, third, or fourth time, or you want to share it with a friend. So thank you again to our supporters of our webinar, the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And we hope you'll join us for our next webinar. We are having monthly webinars. We're still working on January's topic, but you can find us on social media at the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. So thank you all for attending. Thank you, Tamis, Stephanie, and Steve again for your time today. And we will catch you at a later date.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.